At 7:42 in the morning on the 2nd of July, 1937, a United States Coast Guard cutter anchored off a 2-kilometre strip of coral in the middle of the Pacific Ocean received a radio transmission. The voice was a woman's, and it was close enough that the signal nearly overloaded the receiver. She said, "We must be on you but cannot see you. Gas is running low. We are flying at 1,000 feet. The cutter was the Itasca. The island was Howland, 2 kilometers long, 6 meters high, invisible from more than a few miles away. And the voice belonged to Amelia Earhart, the most famous woman in the world, who at that moment had about an hour of fuel left and no idea where she was. 1 hour and 1 minute later she transmitted again, and it was the last thing anyone ever heard from her. She gave a navigation line, 157-337, and said they were running north and south on it. Then nothing. 2 people, 1 aircraft, and the largest sea search the United States had ever mounted found no trace of any of it. 88 years later we still do not know what happened. But we know a great deal more than the legend suggests, because unlike most disappearances, this one was watched. There was a ship listening. There is a radio log, minute by minute. And there is a photograph of almost every stage of it, right up to the last takeoff. To understand why the world stopped for this, you have to understand what she was in 1937. Amelia Earhart was not simply a pilot. She was, by a distance, the most recognizable woman in America, a household name, a magazine cover, a brand. She had flown the Atlantic alone in 1932, the first woman to do it, in a red Lockheed Vega, 14 hours from Newfoundland to a field in Northern Ireland through ice and a broken altimeter and a leaking fuel tank. That aircraft is in the Smithsonian today. Her husband, George Putnam, was a publisher and one of the most effective promoters of the age. He built the public Amelia deliberately, the books, the lecture tours, the clothing line, the luggage. None of that means she was not a serious aviator. It means the flying and the selling of the flying were tied together, and that tie is going to matter when we get to the schedule. By 1937 she was 39 years old and had run out of firsts. The Atlantic was done. The Pacific was done. She had flown Honolulu to Oakland alone in 1935, a leg nobody had survived before. What was left was the circumference of the planet, at its widest point, around the equator. Nobody had done that. She had also been building toward this for 15 years, and the beginning was not glamorous. She took her first flying lesson in 1921 with a woman instructor, Nita Snook, and paid for it by working, photographer, truck driver, social worker. She bought her first aeroplane, a second-hand biplane she called the Canary, before she owned a car. In 1928 she was invited to cross the Atlantic as a passenger, because the sponsors wanted a woman aboard. She went, and she was furious about it afterwards. She said publicly that she had been baggage, like a sack of potatoes, and that the pilots had done all the work. For years later she went back and did it alone. And in January 1935 she did something that is arguably harder than the Atlantic and gets a fraction of the attention. She flew alone from Honolulu to Oakland, 2,400 miles of open Pacific, 18 hours, at night, over water where several pilots attempting the same route had already died. So when we get to the last flight, put aside the idea that she was out of her depth. She had more long-distance over-water experience than almost any pilot alive, and she had already crossed the exact ocean that would kill her. The aircraft was a Lockheed Electra 10E, registration NR16020. Twin-engine, all-metal, fast for its day, and heavily modified. The passenger cabin was stripped out and filled with fuel tanks. Purdue University put up much of the money. The press called it the flying laboratory. The aircraft cost about $80,000 in 1936, somewhere north of $1.5 million in today's money, and she did not have it. Purdue University, where she had taken a post advising women students on careers, raised most of it through a research fund. That is why the press called it the Flying Laboratory. On paper it was a research aircraft, and the research was long-range flight itself. The modifications were extensive. Every passenger seat came out. 6 additional fuel tanks went into the cabin and 2 more into the wings, bringing capacity to about 1,100 gallons, which is roughly 4 times what the aircraft was designed to carry. Fully loaded for the Pacific legs, it weighed about half as much again as a standard Electra. That weight is the thread running through everything. It is why the takeoff at Luke Field went wrong. It is why the runway at La ended at a cliff and she needed all of it. And it is why, when it came to a choice between carrying a radio operator and carrying fuel, the fuel won. It is worth looking at the cockpit of one of these, because it explains a great deal about what went wrong. There is no satellite navigation, no radar, no inertial system. There is a magnetic compass, an airspeed indicator, a clock, and a radio. Finding a 2-kilometre island in an ocean the size of the Pacific came down to arithmetic, the sun, and a stopwatch. Her navigator was Fred Noonan, and Noonan was not a passenger. He was one of the best celestial navigators alive, a former Pan American Airways man who had helped survey the Clipper routes across the Pacific, the very ocean they were now crossing. If you were going to find Howland Island by sextant, Noonan was close to the ideal man to have aboard. There is a persistent story that Noonan was drinking. It comes largely from later recollections and from the fact that he had left Pan Am. It is not supported by anything documentary from the flight itself, and the people who flew with him in those weeks did not report it. It should be treated as an allegation, not a finding. The first attempt was in March 1937, and it went west, Oakland to Honolulu and onward. It ended on the runway at Luke Field, Hawaii, on the 20th of March. On takeoff, heavily loaded, the Electra swung, the landing gear collapsed, and the aircraft ground-looped down the runway in a shower of sparks. Nobody was hurt. The aircraft was badly damaged. It went back to Lockheed by ship for repair, and the whole enterprise had to be rebuilt from the beginning, which cost months, and money, and pushed the second attempt into a completely different season. That delay matters more than it sounds. By the time she was ready again, the weather pattern over the Atlantic and Africa had shifted, so the route had to be reversed, eastbound this time. And an eastbound route meant that the hardest leg in the world, the one to Howland Island, would come at the very end of the journey, with a tired crew and a tired aircraft, instead of near the beginning. They left Miami on the 1st of June, 1937, heading east. Over the following month they crossed the Caribbean, South America, the South Atlantic, Africa, Arabia, India, Burma, Singapore, Indonesia, and Australia. It was, by any measure, an extraordinary piece of flying, and it is almost entirely forgotten because of how it ended. On the 29th of June they landed at La, in New Guinea. 22,000 miles were behind them. 7,000 remained, and almost all of it was open Pacific. It is worth walking the route, because the scale of it is the part that gets lost. From Miami they went to Puerto Rico, then Venezuela, then Dutch Guiana, then across the mouth of the Amazon to Natal on the eastern shoulder of Brazil. From Natal they crossed the South Atlantic to Senegal, 1,900 miles of water in an aircraft with 2 engines and no radar. Then east across Africa, Dakar, Gao on the Niger, Fort Lamy, El Fasher, Khartoum, Massawa on the Red Sea. Then Assab, then a 13-hour crossing of the Arabian Sea straight to Karachi, a leg no aircraft had flown non-stop before. She did it and then gave a radio interview about it the same evening. Then Calcutta in monsoon rain, Akyab, Rangoon, Bangkok, Singapore, Bandung in Java, where the aircraft was held up for repairs to the long-distance instruments, then Surabaya, Kupang, and across the Timor Sea to Darwin in Australia. At Darwin they did something that has been picked over ever since: they shipped home the parachutes. There was no point carrying them, she reasoned, over an ocean where a parachute would only prolong things. It is a small detail, and it tells you she had thought clearly about what the Pacific meant. At Darwin the direction-finding equipment was also repaired, a fuse had blown, and it had apparently been out of action for some time without either of them realizing. That is worth sitting with. The instrument, whose entire purpose was to find a radio beacon, had been dead, silently, over some part of the journey. At La they spent 3 days on maintenance and on radio problems, and they made a decision that has been argued about ever since. They removed equipment to save weight. Among the things left behind, according to the accounts, were a trailing wire antenna and some of the gear associated with the lower radio frequencies. Remember that radio direction finding in 1937 worked best on low frequencies, and low frequencies need a long antenna. What they kept was a system that worked well for talking, and poorly for being found. Those 3 days at La are worth slowing down on, because they are the last time anyone who was not on that aeroplane could still have changed the outcome. The radio was tested and it did not work properly. Transmissions from La were heard, but the quality was poor, and there were problems with the aircraft transmitter that the local operators noted at the time. Nobody grounded her over it. In 1937 nobody had the authority to ground her over anything. This was a private flight, and the only person who could call it off was Amelia Earhart. Noonan had a separate problem. Celestial navigation requires knowing the exact time. A few seconds of error becomes miles of position error. He needed his chronometers checked against a radio time signal, and the reception at La was poor. There are accounts that he was unhappy with the setting of his chronometers when they left. Put those two together and you have the whole disaster in miniature: a navigator who may have been slightly off in time, and a radio that could not be used to correct for it. Either alone is survivable. Both at once, over an ocean, with a target 2 kilometers wide, is not. She also sent a cable to her husband from La. It said that not much more than a month ago she was on the other shore of the Pacific, looking westward, and that this trip was getting measured in hours instead of miles. She signed off, and the next morning they went. The leg from La to Howland was 2,556 miles. It was the longest leg of the entire circumnavigation. It was over open ocean the whole way, and it ended at a target 2 kilometers long and 6 meters high. There was no alternate. If they missed Howland, there was nothing else within range. It is worth asking why Howland at all. The answer is that there was nothing else. Between New Guinea and Hawaii the Pacific is almost empty, and the few specks that exist mostly had no flat ground, no fresh water, and nobody on them. Howland had been claimed by the United States in 1936 under a scheme to establish presence on equatorial islands, and a handful of young men, most of them native Hawaiians recruited from a school in Honolulu, had been living there in tents and small huts, taking weather readings and holding the claim. They are the people in the photographs of the island. 3 runways were graded into the coral for her. The work was done by the Bureau of Air Commerce and the WPA at a cost of around $12,000. They were never used by the aircraft they were built for, and within 5 years the island was under Japanese air attack and then abandoned entirely. The United States government had, for this one flight, built an airstrip on Howland Island and stationed the Coast Guard cutter Itasca offshore to act as a radio beacon, to make smoke, and to guide her in. That is the level of support she had. It was still not enough. They took off from La at 10 in the morning, local time, on the 2nd of July. The runway ended at a cliff above the sea. Film of the takeoff shows the Electra sinking below the level of the cliff top before it climbed away. For the first several hours the position reports were normal. Then the report stopped being positions. From the middle of the night onwards, the Itasca could hear her voice but she never acknowledged hearing theirs, and she never once gave a position. This is the heart of the whole thing, and it is not mysterious, it is technical. Two-way radio requires both stations to be on frequencies each can receive. The Itasca was trying to reach her on frequencies she was probably not listening to, and the direction-finding equipment on Howland needed a signal held long enough and low enough in frequency to take a bearing. She transmitted short and high. At 6:14 in the morning she asked for a bearing and said she would whistle into the microphone. She whistled. The Itasca could not get a fix on it, the transmission was too short, and at that frequency their equipment could not resolve it. At 7:42 came the transmission that everyone remembers. We must be on you but cannot see you. Gas is running low. Been unable to reach you by radio. We are flying at 1,000 feet. The signal strength was maximum. She was, by every estimate, very close. Think about what that means. Close enough that her radio nearly overloaded a receiver on the island, and she could not see it. Howland is flat, pale, and small, in an ocean full of cloud shadows that look exactly like small flat pale islands. At 1,000 feet, the horizon is about 40 miles away, and everything in it looks the same. The Itasca was making smoke, burning oil to lay a black plume over the island. The sea was calm and the smoke lay flat on the water instead of rising. From the air, in that light, it may have looked like nothing at all. It is worth being precise about the radio problem, because it is the single most consequential thing in this story and it was not one failure but four, stacked. 1. The direction-finding equipment on Howland Island was a Navy set, borrowed, running on batteries. By the morning of the 2nd of July those batteries were flat. The one piece of equipment specifically placed there to take a bearing on her was dead when she arrived. 2. She asked the Itasca to transmit on a frequency her own direction finder could not use well, and she asked them to send a long dash, then did not hold her own transmissions long enough for them to return the favor. 3. The schedule. She was transmitting on the hour and the half-hour by her own plan, which meant long silences in between, and the Itasca had no way to interrupt her, because she could not hear them. And 4, underneath all of it, she was not a trained radio operator, and neither was Noonan. In 1937 long-range flying still assumed a third crew member whose entire job was the radio. She had removed that seat to carry fuel. Every decision here is defensible on its own. Together they left two people over an ocean with a radio that could talk and not listen. At 8:43, the last message anyone is confident about. We are on the line 157337. We will repeat this message. We are running on line north and south. That number is the most useful thing she ever said, and it is worth explaining. A single observation of the sun does not give you a position, it gives you a line, running at right angles to the sun, somewhere on which you must be. That morning, that line ran 157 degrees and 337 degrees, and it passed through Howland Island. Noonan knew exactly what to do with it. When you have a sun line through your destination and you cannot see the destination, you fly along that line, first one way, then the other, until the island appears. That is what running north and south means. It is textbook, competent navigation, and it is the last thing we know they were doing. The Itasca began searching within the hour. Within days it had become the largest and most expensive air and sea search in American history to that point. The battleship Colorado sent float planes over the islands to the south. The aircraft carrier Lexington arrived with 63 aircraft. Roughly 4,000 men and around 250,000 square miles of ocean were covered, at a cost of about $4 million in 1937 money. They found nothing. Not a slick, not a float, not a piece of wing. Before we get to the conclusion, the arithmetic, because everything downstream depends on it. The Electra left La with about 1,100 US gallons. At the cruise settings she was using, that gives somewhere between 20 and 24 hours of flying, depending on how hard she leaned the mixture and how much headwind she met. She had been airborne 20 hours and 13 minutes when she said gas was running low. So she was not exaggerating and she was not yet empty. On the most generous reading she had perhaps 3 or 4 hours left. On the least generous she had 1. That window is precisely the argument between the two main theories, because 3 hours of fuel is enough to reach Nikumaroro, and 1 hour is not. There was also a headwind. The weather forecast she was given at La underestimated it. Modern reconstructions using historical weather data suggest she may have been fighting 20 to 25 knots more than she planned for across the middle of that leg, which would put her behind schedule and short of fuel at exactly the point where she needed both. The search itself is worth following day by day, because the decisions made in the first 48 hours shaped everything. The Itasca began by searching northwest of Howland, on the reasoning that she had overshot. That was a defensible guess and it was probably the wrong one, because the line she announced, 157337, runs northwest to southeast. Flying it southeast from Howland takes you toward the Phoenix Islands, and Gardner. The battleship Colorado arrived a week later and did send floatplanes south, over the Phoenix group, including Gardner Island. 3 aircraft flew over it on the 9th of July. The pilots saw signs of recent habitation and no aircraft and no people, and they did not land. Nobody has ever been able to settle what those pilots saw. The island had been inhabited before and would be again, so vegetation clearings and old structures were not surprising. But if the Nikumaroro theory is right, then 3 U.S. Navy aircraft flew over 2 living people 1 week after the disappearance, and went home. There is one more thing about that week. The tide. Reconstructions of the reef at Gardner show that an aircraft landed on the flat coral shelf at low water would be workable for a few days, able to run an engine and transmit at low tide, and then, on a rising sea, be pushed off the edge of the reef into deep water. Which would explain why the post-loss signals stop, and why nothing was on the surface a week later. That is a chain of ifs, and I want to be honest that it is a chain of ifs. But it is a chain in which every link is physically possible, and it accounts for facts the official answer does not touch, the radio receptions, the sun line, the bones, the shoe. The official conclusion was the simplest one. She missed Howland, ran out of fuel, ditched in deep water, and the aircraft sank. In a sea that is 5,000 meters deep in that region, an aluminium aircraft going down intact leaves very little on the surface, and what it does leave scatters within hours. Except that for several days afterwards, people kept hearing her. In the days following the disappearance, dozens of radio receptions were reported, by Navy and Coast Guard stations, by commercial operators, and by amateurs across the Pacific and as far away as the United States. Some were obvious hoaxes. Some were misheard. But a number of them were logged by professional operators on the correct frequency. The Navy took them seriously enough to act. On the 5th of July, 3 days after the disappearance, radio bearings were taken on a signal on her frequency by stations at Wake, Midway, and Pearl Harbor. Those bearings crossed in the general area of the Phoenix Islands, southeast of Howland. That is one reason the Colorado was sent to look there at all. Some of the receptions included fragments that operators wrote down at the time, a position given in degrees, a reference to being on a reef south of the equator, a repeated call sign. Others were plainly people hearing what they wanted to hear, and a few were deliberate hoaxes that were traced and exposed within days. Sorting the real from the imagined is genuinely hard, and the people who have tried have come to different conclusions. What can be said is this: a significant number were logged by professional operators, on the correct frequency, at times when a transmitter running off an aircraft engine would have been possible, and they stop after about the 6th of July, which is roughly when the rising tide would have taken an aircraft off a reef. The most disgust came from a 15-year-old girl in Florida named Betty Klenk, who wrote down what she heard over 3 hours in a notebook that still exists. It records a woman's voice, distressed, repeating a name, and a male voice that seemed injured and confused. Here is why these reports matter, and it is a physical argument rather than a romantic one. The Electra's radio ran off a generator driven by the right engine. The aircraft could only transmit if an engine was running. An engine could only run if the aircraft was on land, dry, and upright. If any of those post-loss signals were genuine, then the aeroplane did not sink in deep water that morning. It landed somewhere. And that single deduction is the entire foundation of the second theory. 350 miles southeast of Howland, along the very line she said she was flying, there is an uninhabited coral atoll. In 1937 it was called Gardner Island. Today it is called Nikumaroro. A week after the disappearance, aircraft from the Colorado flew over Gardner. The pilots reported signs of recent habitation but saw nobody, and moved on. The island had been settled and abandoned before, so signs of habitation were not surprising. 3 years later, in 1940, a British colonial officer named Gerald Gallagher was working on the island. His men found a partial human skeleton, about 13 bones, along with the remains of a fire, bird and turtle bones that had been eaten, part of a woman's shoe, and a sextant box. Gallagher thought immediately of Earhart and said so in his telegrams. The bones were sent to Fiji and examined in 1941 by a doctor named Hoodless, who concluded they belonged to a middle-aged man of stocky build. That closed the matter, and the bones were subsequently lost. But Hoodless recorded his measurements, and measurements survive even when bones do not. In 1998, 2 forensic anthropologists reanalyzed those numbers with modern methods and concluded the original identification was unreliable, and that the measurements were consistent with a woman of European descent of Earhart's height. In 2018 a further study went harder, comparing the measurements against a large reference sample and against Earhart's own dimensions, taken from her clothing and photographs. Its conclusion was that the bones were more similar to Earhart than to 99% of individuals in the reference sample. That is a strong statement and it deserves a strong caveat, which the paper itself makes. This is a reanalysis of one man's handwritten measurements from 1941, of bones nobody can examine, taken by someone whose competence at that task is unknown. It is evidence. It is not identification, and no DNA has ever been obtained. Expeditions to the island since the 1990s have recovered other things: fragments of a glass jar consistent with a brand of freckle cream sold in the 1930s, a zipper pull, part of a compact, and a piece of aluminium sheet whose origin is disputed. None of it is conclusive. All of it is the kind of thing a castaway leaves. The organization that has pushed the Nikumaroro case hardest is TIRE, a group of aviation archaeologists who have mounted a dozen expeditions to the island since 1989. They have been criticized, sometimes fairly, for announcing more than their evidence supports. But they are also the only people who have systematically searched the place. Their strongest single item is a photograph taken in October 1937 by a British officer named Eric Bevington, who was surveying the island 3 months after the disappearance. In the water at the edge of the reef, his picture shows an object that some analysts have identified as a landing gear assembly, and others as a natural feature or a piece of an older wreck. The island already had a shipwreck on its reef, the SS Norwich City, aground since 1929, with debris scattered along the shoreline. That wreck is the standing problem for every artifact found there. Any piece of rusted metal on that beach has an ordinary explanation sitting a few hundred meters away. It is worth being concrete about what surviving there would have meant. Nikumaroro has no fresh water. It has coconut crabs the size of a dinner plate that will take anything organic left on the ground overnight, which is one proposed explanation for why only 13 bones were ever found of a whole skeleton. Daytime temperatures on open coral run well above 40 degrees. A person coming ashore there without water would have days, not weeks. The campfire, the bird and turtle bones, the fragments of a small fire-blackened container, all of that describes somebody trying, competently, for a short time, and then not. What the wreck does not explain is a woman's shoe, a jar of American freckle cream, and a campfire with the bones of birds and turtles that somebody cooked. It also does not explain why a British officer wrote, in 1940, that the skeleton might be Amelia Earhart, 3 years before anybody had a theory to fit. There is a third story, and it needs dealing with because it will not go away, that she was captured by the Japanese. The version most often repeated has the Electra coming down in the Marshall Islands, then under Japanese administration, with Earhart and Noonan taken to Saipan and dying there. It rests almost entirely on recollections gathered decades later, and on the general atmosphere of the years before the Pacific War. In 2017 a photograph surfaced that appeared to show 2 Western figures on a dock in the Marshall Islands, and it was presented as evidence. Within days, a researcher located the same photograph in a Japanese travel book, published in 1935, 2 years before the flight. That is how quickly this theory collapses whenever something testable is attached to it. No document has ever surfaced in any Japanese, American, or British archive supporting a capture, and a great many documents from that period have surfaced. Treated as folklore. And in 2024 there was one more episode worth knowing about, because it is a good lesson in how this subject works. A deep-sea survey company released a sonar image of a plane-shaped object on the seabed about 100 miles from Howland, at 5,000 meters. It was reported worldwide. When they went back the following year with better equipment, it was a rock formation. So here is what the evidence supports. 2 competent people flew an aircraft with a compromised radio installation to the hardest destination on the planet, at the end of a month of exhausting flying, and could not find it. That much is documented minute by minute in the log of a ship that was listening the whole time. After that the record splits. The official answer, they ditched and sank, fits the fuel, fits the silence, and fits the total absence of wreckage in very deep water. The Nikumaroro answer fits the sun line she gave, fits the post-loss signals needing dry land, and fits a set of objects on an uninhabited island that are individually weak and collectively uncomfortable. Neither has ever been proven, and 88 years of searching has not produced one identifiable piece of that aeroplane. What we are left with is a woman who understood exactly what she was attempting. She had written to her husband before an earlier flight that women must try to do things as men have tried, and that failure must be a challenge to others. There is an aftermath to this that almost nobody tells, and it is the saddest part. When the Navy stopped searching on the 18th of July, George Putnam did not. He paid for private vessels to keep looking through the Phoenix and Gilbert groups. He chased down radio reports personally. He wrote to island administrators across the Pacific asking them to keep their eyes open. He kept it up for over a year. In January 1939, a court in Los Angeles declared Amelia Earhart legally dead. Putnam had requested it, not because he had given up, but because the estate could not be settled and her affairs could not be closed while she was legally missing. It is a piece of paperwork, and it is the closest thing to an ending this story has. Her mother, Amy, never accepted it. She believed for the rest of her life that her daughter had come down somewhere and been held, and she said so publicly. She died in 1962, still waiting. And the flying did not stop with her. Earhart had helped found the 99s in 1929, an organization of licensed women pilots that still exists, and that was the first of its kind anywhere. When the United States needed pilots in the war that came 4 years after she disappeared, there was already a generation of women who held licenses because of the argument she had spent her life making. So why does this one, out of all the aircraft lost over water in the 1930s, refuse to close? Part of it is that she was famous, and part of it is that she was a woman doing something that a great many people had told her she could not do. But the technical reason is more specific than that, and it is the same reason the Bermuda cases stay open. There was a witness. A ship sat off that island for a day and a half with its radio room manned, writing down every word. We have the log. We know almost to the minute when she was close, and we know exactly what she said last. And then the record simply stops, in the middle of a competent search pattern, with an ocean 5,000 meters deep underneath. Mysteries with no evidence fade. Mysteries with almost enough evidence do not. This one has a transcript that takes you right up to the edge and then hands you nothing, and 88 years later, people are still standing at that edge looking down. If you want more case files, they are on this channel: a Navy collier that vanished with 309 men and never sent a signal, a colony of 115 people who dismantled their own houses and walked away, a book nobody has read in 600 years. Subscribe, and tell me in the comments which ending you would put your money on. 1. She ditched and sank. 2. She landed on Nikumaroro. 3. Something we have not found yet.